Women were a huge driving force behind the progressive era. But what exactly did they do, and what exactly were they able to accomplish? That's what we're going to look at today on Mr. E's Classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today we're going to take a look at women in the progressive era. Specifically, we're going to look at the question, how did women contribute to the progressive era, and what major victories did they have? So what were conditions like for women at the beginning of the progressive era? We're talking right around 1900, right there at the turn of the 20th century. For most women, they had to work, especially if they were living in cities. This meant, just like the men, there was a lot of difficult working conditions. On top of that, most women were expected to give their paychecks to the man of their life, be it their husband, their father, maybe a brother or an uncle, whoever was the quote-unquote man of their life. That's who they had to turn their paycheck over to. That was just the custom of the day. That's how it was. Most women were also kind of treated like second-class citizens. They didn't really get all the same privileges that a man would have at the time. And probably the biggest thing was that women didn't have the right to vote. They didn't really get a voice in the government. Now that we kind of understand what the conditions were like for most women at the beginning of the 20th century, let's look at some notable women of the progressive era that really accomplished some pretty remarkable things. The first notable woman that I want to take a look at is a lady named Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley founded an organization called the National Consumer League. Kelley believed that women were paying way too much for goods that they had to have in order to run their home, the household. So what she did is she kind of teamed up with businesses to identify and recommend good products that were made under fair conditions and healthy conditions. Products that were made by companies that paid their workers a fair wage, that treated women workers especially pretty good. And if these companies agreed, they would have a small little kind of tag or label attached to their products so that when women were out shopping, they would know, hey, I can buy product X versus product Y over here because product X is made by a company that really seems to care. Kelley really helped push the idea that running a home was just as much of a job as anything else. And she really focused on the idea that women really were managers of the household. The next notable woman we need to look at is a lady named Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is given credit for opening the country's first birth control clinic way back in 1916. She also helped found an organization called the American Birth Control League. This is really important because people back at the turn of the century were still having incredibly large families, especially people that were living in the cities. This was kind of a problem. A lot of people were still of the mindset of the farm. Now, it's very beneficial on a farm to have a large family because that meant free labor. In the city, on the other hand, you still had to be able to feed that family, which meant you needed to have either a lot of people working and bringing money in, or you had to have a really good job that paid really well in order to be able to afford the food for everything. Sanger really helped push the idea of if you have less kids, that makes for an overall better family life. Birth control was a way to try to accomplish that. Another great woman of note of the progressive era was a lady named Ida Wells. She was a black teacher and journalist, actually from Tennessee. She helped found an organization called the National Association of Colored Women. They fought for women's suffrage, or the right to vote, and Wells also really spoke out against lynchings and Jim Crow laws in the South. She adamantly believed in equal treatment for everybody, everywhere. We'll go into a little more depth on Ida B. Wells in another section. The next two women we need to take a look at were incredibly instrumental in the passage of the 19th Amendment. The first lady is a lady named Carrie Chapman Catt. She is kind of the de facto leader of the progressive era's women's suffrage movement. She was the president of a group called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This group had a two-pronged approach for women's suffrage. The first was a state-level approach. They used the referendum process to gain the right for women to vote at the state level. The second prong was a federal approach. They used the petition process in order to gain the constitutional amendment that would kind of solidify women's right to vote. We call that the 19th Amendment. Right next to Carrie Chapman Catt was a lady named Alice Paul. Alice Paul was kind of known as the suffragette with the radical approach. Alice Paul used some very kind of out there in your face approaches in order to gain the right to vote for women. She would use things like marches and big protests. And at one point she went on what was called a hunger strike. She refused to eat anything. She also helped form what was called the National Woman's Party. This group really pushed at the national level for women's right to vote. Like I said before, these drastic approaches were very much in-your-face style of getting what they wanted. Here's a great example of a march or a protest that took place. Notice that this is not a tiny little thing happening. Look at all the people. Also look at all the ladies carrying the signs. This was kind of a big deal. Here's another great example of kind of the in-your-face approach that Paul used. A lot of times she or people within her organization would protest outside the White House. They were very, very visible. In fact, some of them would go as far as to chain themselves to the front gates of the White House, so anybody coming or going would have to go past and notice them. I mentioned earlier the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment is the amendment that finally gives women the right to vote here in the United States. So how exactly did it come about? The 19th Amendment was the ultimate goal for women's suffrage here in America. I've mentioned the word suffrage a couple of times now. Suffrage is a fancy word that just means the right to vote. Why were women fighting for suffrage during the Progressive Era? Most women would argue that it was necessary for them to be able to have the right to vote in order to ensure that the government would protect and support the family life or the home life. Women thought that the government really needed to step in and help them out. If they had a chance to vote, then the people in government would be forced to listen to what they were having to say, and some of the problems could get fixed. Once again, it's the 19th Amendment that finally gives women the right to vote. In fact, the 19th Amendment actually says the right to vote, quote, shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. Gender cannot be used as a reason to deny anyone a vote. Because of the persistence of the women's suffrage movement, eventually Congress did approve the 19th Amendment and sent it out to the states to be ratified. If you'll think back to government class, remember that that's kind of how the process happens if you want to change the Constitution. Congress approves it, then 3/4 of states have to also approve it. Well, back in the early 1900s, when we had 48 states, that meant that 36 states were required to ratify this amendment in order for it to be added to the Constitution. 35 states ratified the amendment fairly quickly. 12 pretty much flat out said no. Tennessee was the last state to vote. This is where we get the term Perfect 36. Tennessee was incredibly instrumental in the passage of the 19th Amendment. Like I said earlier, they were the last state to vote. If they voted, 36 states would ratify, which meant the 19th Amendment would be added to the Constitution. If they voted no, the amendment died. Well, it's bad enough that it came down to one state. It was that close. It was actually even closer. It actually came down to one vote from one person. This guy right here. Harry T. Byrne. Harry Byrne was a senator from McMinn County. He actually lived in a little town called Nyota. He was the last person in the legislature to vote. Before he cast his vote, the vote was split right down the middle, 50-50. If he voted yes, it passed. Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment, is added to the Constitution. If he voted no, then Tennessee didn't ratify and the 19th Amendment died. Talk about some serious pressure on your shoulders. And he was only 23 at the time. There's a story about Harry Burn and his vote that goes something like this. Harry Burn's mom wrote him a letter before he left for Nashville for this ratification vote. And in the letter, to kind of paraphrase it, she speaks about how wonderful of a son he is and how she really would like the opportunity to vote for him. And at the end of the letter, she says, "Don't forget to be a good boy." What she's really saying in that letter is, "Don't disappoint me, son. I know how you should vote. You better vote that way." Well, Harry was a good son. He listened to his mother. He was a good boy. He voted yes. Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment. 36 states ratified the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, and women across the country were allowed to vote. So what exactly does the passage of the 19th Amendment mean for the United States? The big outcome of that passage was that progressivism has proved itself to be a pretty dominant force in politics. Things were getting done. Progressives were making changes in society. It was almost a new era in government. It also meant that big business was put on notice. They weren't going to be able to push people around or throw money at problems anymore. And it also signaled that there were some serious changes on the horizon for the United States. And that kind of wraps up women in the progressive era. 3 takeaways for you. Number 1, remember that some progressive women were really working to help the home. Number 2, many progressive women were working to get the right to vote. And number 3, passage of the 19th Amendment marked a major turning point for us. Hopefully, guys, you got some great notes out of that. Hopefully you were paying attention because there's going to be a quiz. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, remember, don't ever stop learning.